Hello, friends. Tonight I'm going to take you on a rather unusual journey. Don't worry, there's no war, no apocalypse, and no love story either. But trust me, what I have is just as strange, intriguing, and even thought-provoking as any of those. Dim the lights, lean back, maybe turn on that sweet humming of a fan, because in ancient Rome, we're going to the toilet. Yes, you heard that right. When you think of Rome, gladiators, arenas, and triumphal arches might come to mind. But tonight, I'm taking you somewhere else, into the most honest, unfiltered part of Roman daily life. Those curious stone rows called latrinas. Now, close your eyes and picture it. We're in the 1st century AD. Men in togas stroll by with scrolls in hand. Slaves carry jugs through the streets. Street musicians play in the distance. Everything seems great. Until, let's say, you need to use the toilet. You can't exactly say, let me just go to the bathroom, because bathrooms only exist in wealthy homes. Let's say you are rich. Even then, that's not where the real action was. In Rome, toilets were public, but these public spaces weren't like the public restrooms we know today. It wasn't a walk in, do your business, and leave kind of place. This was a place for both physical and social release. Imagine long stone benches, each with round holes carved into them. No partitions, no doors, no curtains. A nightmare for anyone who avoids eye contact. But for Romans, this was completely normal. People would even bring friends with them. They would chat and gossip as they relieved themselves. Just imagine 2 men sitting side by side, one annoyed about gladiators, the other talking about his lover, laughter and the occasional ah filling the air, all above a canal of flowing waste. But that was Roman life. For them, the line between private and public was much more porous. One of the most interesting parts? The cleaning tool was a sponge tied to a stick, and this sponge was communal. Yes, there was a single sponge that everyone used. After each use, it would be dipped into a bucket of salty water, rinsed, and passed on to the next person. Forget everything you know about hygiene. This was a different world entirely. According to some archaeologists, even the bucket sometimes overflowed with filth. So the water used to clean the sponge wasn't exactly clean anymore. But still, the Romans found ways to cope. Deodorizing herbs, vinegar mixes, lavender water, whatever helped. In these shared toilets, it wasn't uncommon to run into rats or snakes. These animals would crawl up through the pipes, especially at night, offering some unpleasant surprises. And yes, sometimes those surprises were deadly. In a place like that, even a small scratch could mean infection. Still, Romans saw these spaces as social centers, not just the general public. Aristocrats used them too. And the most interesting part? These public toilets were usually built right next to city squares, forums, and bathhouses. People would listen to a senator's speech in the morning, stop by the latrina, and then enjoy a relaxing bath. Another curious tradition. Forgetting the sponge stick outside was considered disrespectful. Returning it to its place was seen as a sign of respect for the community. Everyone understood they were part of the same circle. The humor that emerged from this environment was also quite something. People carved writings into the latrina walls. Cassius sat here and thought, or next the bath, then my lover. These little notes turned stone walls into personal diaries. Maybe strange, maybe gross, but deeply human. Because Roman toilets are one of the clearest windows into daily life, thought patterns, and social cultural dynamics of that time. Toilets weren't just a necessity, they were a social mirror. Interestingly, some of these writings even carried political messages. Taxes have clogged me up, or this poop bee is more boring than the senator's speech. Lines like these revealed the Roman sense of humor. People didn't send letters to newspapers. They wrote on the toilet wall. Sometimes, full-on political gossip was exchanged here. The emperor's health, new taxes, a general's loyalty, all debated over latrine holes. For some, this wasn't just a place for waste. It was a forum for information exchange. Some historians even claim spies were posted in latrinas to keep an ear on public sentiment. There were even small music groups that performed near some toilets, especially those next to bathhouses. Flutists or little instrumentalists played music to help people relax while doing their business. Imagine that, handling your business to the soft sound of a lyre in the background. Even luxury restaurants today don't think of details like that. And then there's the time people spent there. This wasn't a quick in and out stop. People sat for long periods, chatted, even got lost in thought. These were some of the few places you could truly be alone with yourself. Some people would even write poetry in this setting. That's why the toilet experience in ancient Rome wasn't just an action. It was a ritual in its own right, a ritual performed at the beginning or end of the day, sometimes accompanied by conversation, sometimes by music, sometimes by deep thought. It may sound strange, but it's not far-fetched to think that what we now call civilization might have taken shape 2,000 years ago on stone benches. Maybe what truly made Rome Rome wasn't the swords in the arenas, but the conversations in the latrinas. The latrina culture in ancient Rome wasn't confined to city centers. Rome's infrastructure mindset was highly advanced for its time. When cities were planned, the location of the toilets, their connection to the sewage system, and access to water were all specifically calculated. A latrina wasn't just a toilet. It was an extension of engineering, architecture, and public life. These public toilets, often located in city centers, were typically built right next to bathhouses. For Romans, cleanliness was a holistic concept. First stop, the toilet. Second, the bathhouse. Third, the forum. It was a journey designed to cleanse both body and mind. Defecating, bathing, and conversing. Together, these formed a cycle of purification. The physical structure of the latrina was also carefully designed. Long benches carved from stone, with evenly spaced round seating holes, and often a narrow water channel flowing in front of each seat. This channel served both for cleaning and for odor reduction. While germ theory wasn't known yet, there was a widespread belief that foul smells caused illness. The idea that odor equals disease had taken root in Roman society. Most latrinas were located in open courtyards. Some, however, were enclosed, but these were usually luxury toilets catering to the upper class. Sitting in open areas wasn't considered a lack of privacy, but rather a form of socialization. From today's perspective, it may seem awkward or overly exposed, but in Rome, this openness was seen as a communal necessity. In some toilets, you'd notice more elaborate details. Small columns between the seats, walls decorated with frescoes, even hanging ornaments from the ceiling. These touches made using the toilet not just functional, but an aesthetic experience as well. For Romans, these toilets were also a symbol of status. The latrina you used said something about your social circle and position. Large latrinas, located near forums, were known for more intellectual and political discussions. If someone was seen there often, it meant they had something worth saying. Some sources mention specially designed, partitioned latrinas for emperors or high-ranking officials. These were separated from the general public, but not completely isolated. In Roman culture, isolation was equated with arrogance. Even an emperor was expected to mingle with the public, within reasonable limits. Inscriptions placed at the entrance of latrinas explained how these public spaces were to be used. Messages like, "Wait your turn," "Return the sponge," "Don't disturb others while talking," show how seriously toilet etiquette was taken. The earliest examples of signs we now see in modern restrooms first appeared in Roman latrinas. And perhaps the most interesting aspect, these toilets were used as communication hubs. The writings carved into the walls weren't just personal thoughts. Sometimes they were announcements, love letters, or political protests. Phrases like, "Julia, I'll wait for you here," were words of hope etched into stone. It was like writing an open letter to the public. Gossip also flourished in these spaces. People spent a long time there, chatting and debating with those beside them. There are even anecdotes of philosophers teaching their students in the latrinas. Because in Rome, life and learning weren't confined to formal settings. Knowledge could be found anywhere. That's why the latrina was not just an architectural structure, but also a sociological platform. Romans didn't see it as a burden. They saw it as an opportunity. Maybe a little smelly, maybe a bit crowded, but definitely alive and breathing. And when we look back at those stone benches today, we don't just see places where people once sat. We see how a society thought, communicated, and lived together. Some sources even mention that certain latrinas became trendy, like today's popular cafes. There were latrinas in Rome, known as the places where the best gossip happens. People would sit and talk about everything from the latest perfume scents to gladiator matches, from politics to love affairs, all on those stone seats. Young people in particular made a habit of gathering there in the late afternoons. It might sound odd to use a latrina as a meeting spot, but in Rome, that was perfectly normal. Some romances even began, or ended, there. Toilet culture was so deeply embedded in Roman society that some wealthy families decorated their home walls with latrina-style stone motifs. It was a way of honoring tradition and showing a sense of humor. A good latrina joke, when well-timed, was considered a mark of wit. For this reason, the Roman concept of toilets wasn't just about bodily functions. It was also a space where social intelligence and cultural awareness were shaped. Today, people may turn up their noses at toilet humor, but in those times, one might be surprised at how prominent that kind of humor was in society. The latrina culture of ancient Rome wasn't limited to city dwellers. The Roman Empire's reach was so vast that from Britain to North Africa, from Anatolia to Spain, traces of this culture can be found everywhere. The interesting part, the latrina layout was nearly identical in every region. It had been standardized, which is a clear reflection of how organized and centralized Roman civilization was. This system even applied to military camps. Portable toilets were set up for legionnaires in temporary encampments. Yes, you heard right. Mobile latrinas. These portable setups were connected by small trenches and pipes and were cleaned after use. This practice shows just how meticulous the Roman system was in maintaining soldiers' hygiene. Soldier morale was important, but so was soldier health. Even in Roman settlements as far north as Hadrian's Wall, in present-day Scotland, the same toilet system was in use. It wasn't just engineering. It was the transfer of culture. Romans spread the latrina system as a sort of standard of civilization. At the center of this system was water. Rome's genius in water engineering was the most significant factor in the development of the latrina culture. Thanks to aqueducts, clean water was delivered to city centers, bathhouses, and toilets. This water was used for both cleaning and waste removal. This dual-purpose use is considered an early version of today's gray water systems. The sewer systems under latrinas were connected to major arteries like the Cloaca Maxima. Cloaca Maxima, or the Great Sewer, was a massive infrastructure running through the heart of Rome, carrying waste into the Tiber River. Some parts of this ancient network still exist today, and can even be toured with a guide. So, when modern cities proudly show off their sewer systems, they're really just building on what Rome achieved 2,000 years ago. The fact that some modern cities still haven't reached this level shows just how advanced Roman engineering was. The latrina wasn't just a system that used water. It was a system that respected water. Wastefulness was frowned upon. In some areas, inscriptions warned against excessive water use or letting it run unnecessarily. Warnings like aqua non est ludus, water is not a toy, were carved into stone. These inscriptions weren't just rules. They were social messages that reflected the values of the time. In Rome, information flowed as freely as water. These places were communication hubs, especially in small towns along trade routes. Travelers would stop at latrinas to rest and exchange the day's news. Another striking feature was the artistic contribution of latrinas. In some regions, the walls of latrinas were adorned with mosaics, frescoes, or ornate stonework. These decorations weren't just for aesthetics. They also showed that latrinas were used as public art spaces. Art found its way even into toilets. Of course, this appreciation for aesthetics also highlighted class divisions. Latrinas in wealthy neighborhoods were decorated, spacious, pleasant-smelling, and well-ventilated, while those used by the lower classes were simpler and more basic. Yet, the system was still accessible to everyone. This culture of shared use contributed to Rome's social cohesion. Another interesting detail was the education of children about toilet use. Some frescoes depict adults teaching children how to sit properly and how to use the communal sponge. So the latrina also functioned as a space for education. Children became part of this culture early, learning the rules and experiencing socialization through it. For women, the situation was a bit different. There were latrinas with designated sections for women, but this wasn't universally applied. Separate areas were typically constructed in larger or wealthier cities. However, some inscriptions indicate that women also shared latrinas with men. So it wasn't a strict division. Where people sat often depended on social status or local customs more than gender. In ancient Rome, living collectively didn't just mean inhabiting the same city. It meant sharing the same water, sitting on the same stone, and enduring the same smells. The latrina symbolized this shared life. People didn't just relieve themselves here. They built social bonds, exchanged information, and lived the rhythms of daily life together. Perhaps that's why one of Rome's greatest achievements wasn't just that people stood side by side in battle, but that they could also sit side by side on the toilet. This discipline was so widespread in military life that it's known some legionnaires were assigned specifically to clean the latrinas. While such a task might be seen as lowly today, in Rome, it was a sign of responsibility. Ensuring cleanliness was directly tied to protecting the health of the unit. Some texts even mention that soldiers who did this job well were rewarded. These spaces also helped build trust among soldiers. Conversations held while waiting in line for the latrina created some of the most genuine bonds. Especially after standing shoulder to shoulder in war, some archaeologists have discovered that legionnaires played games in the latrinas, organizing small competitions with stones. This made the toilet not just a place for physical relief, but also a rest stop, even a source of entertainment. In fact, inscriptions carved into certain stones suggest that some latrinas were considered lucky. Phrases like, "This hole has always brought me peace," reveal a mystical layer to it. People left behind more than just waste in these spaces. They left behind beliefs, hopes, and sometimes prayers. All of this shows that ancient Roman toilets were not just engineering marvels. They were spaces that reflected people's inner worlds, their fears, thoughts, and relationships. The latrina culture of ancient Rome expressed itself not only on a physical level, but also spiritually and symbolically. Some historians even interpret Roman toilets not merely as public infrastructure, but as ritual spaces. Yes, defecation was a biological need, but it also symbolized release, purification, and reset. That's why some Romans prayed before using the toilet, especially to the god Stercutius. Yes, you heard that correctly. There was a god of defecation. Stercutius was considered a form of the agricultural god Saturnus, symbolizing the fertilization of the earth through human waste. In this context, the latrina was not just a place to dispose of waste, but part of a sacred cycle of returning nutrients to the soil. Some inscriptions even include brief prayers to this deity. O Stercutius, carry this burden too. Simple, yet meaningful, because this prayer symbolized both physical release and the shedding of mental burdens. In these toilets, not just the body, but the spirit was cleansed. Wealthy Romans, in particular, would burn aromatic herbs and use spa-like methods to make the environment more soothing. Plants like lavender, sage, and juniper were burned as incense, making the latrina function almost like a miniature wellness spa. Of course, cleanliness was also a vital part of this ritual. The sponge on a stick followed a specific routine. First dipped in water, then rubbed with antiseptic herbs, and then used. This process had to be quick, as there was usually a line, but for some, it carried almost religious significance. In some homes, especially among the aristocracy, the toilet areas were among the most ornate parts of the house. Marble carved seats, mosaic floors, bronze wash basins, even poems etched into the walls. Even the sponges used were made from luxurious fabrics. Cleanliness mattered, but so did presentation. It was prestigious enough to show off to guests. Some letters even include wealthy hosts boasting about their toilets. "My new marble seats await your visit." Such statements show how the latrina had become a status symbol. Even the location of the latrina within the home signified status. In some houses, they were positioned to overlook private gardens, so the user could be at one with nature, while physically unburdening themselves. It was a moment of serenity, of mental and physical emptiness. Some philosophers interpreted toilet use as a form of harmony with nature. Stoics, in particular, saw the process as part of the natural cycle. A wall inscription attributed to the philosopher Epictetus beautifully summarizes this. Just as the leaf falls, so too must man let go. The latrina was also a place of equality. Rich or poor, everyone sat on the same hole, shared the same sponge. It was one of the few spaces where social classes dissolved. The idea that an emperor and a common citizen could sit side by side in the same latrina speaks volumes about the strange but functional equality of Roman society. Folk tales speak of people from different classes meeting and forming friendships, even marrying, after encounters in the latrina. It might not seem romantic, but in ancient Rome, true love sometimes began on a stone bench. Humorous sayings like, "We sat together, we smelled it together," show just how internalized this culture had become. These spaces also offered a way to cope with loneliness. Elderly people who lived alone would come and sit in the latrina during the day just to talk with others. No one turned them away because the latrina belonged to everyone. It was, in a way, a silent space of acceptance. In some places, musicians and storytellers even performed outside the latrinas. People would relieve themselves inside, then step out and enjoy the sound of a flute. In the Roman sense, the latrina was the equivalent of what we now call public space. Not only the body, but also the soul was released there. Some sources note that people were far more tense elsewhere, but inside the latrina, they became more relaxed and open-minded. Perhaps true release brings not just physical relief, but mental as well. And all of this shows the latrina in ancient Rome was not just a stone structure, it was a space for individual and collective cleansing, a place where the body, mind, and soul emptied and rebuilt themselves simultaneously. Today, we see the toilet as purely functional, but for the Romans, it was a unique space where nature, culture, and humanity converged. Even more surprisingly, some Roman citizens are documented to have meditated while waiting in line for the latrina in the mornings. These people would wait silently in line, listen to nature, and for some, even this waiting period was a form of spiritual preparation. Some seats had special inscriptions above them. Short phrases like, "Think here," or "Respect the silence," showed that the latrina was not only a physical stop, but also a mental pause. Some toilet stones even had small philosophical questions carved into them. Is the burden inside heavier than what comes out? These lines, etched into the stone, show how open Romans were to introspection. A toilet hole could become a hole for thought, just like how today, inspiration strikes in coffee shops, office breaks, or morning showers. In Rome, it often came while sitting on the toilet. Some records suggest that poets composed their first lines here in the morning, and philosophers clarified their ideas in this space. This proves that the toilet was not only a place for the body, but for thought production as well. Today, modern offices design creative rooms. Rome solved this 2,000 years ago on a simple stone seat. Perhaps the most intimate think tank in history was nothing more than a little hole. In ancient Rome, the latrina was not just a social and architectural structure. It was also a tool of public order and even state governance. Hard to believe, but in some toilets, the eyes of the state were present, especially in heavily used public latrinas. These places turned into informal centers for gathering information. Some historians mention sources indicating that spies were stationed in latrinas during the Roman Empire. These individuals would sit like ordinary citizens and carefully listen to the conversations around them, because when people relaxed, they spoke more, and more honestly. When the body loosened, so did the tongue. For this reason, latrinas weren't just places of relief. They were barometers of public mood. If conversations were full of anger, it signaled that taxes were too high, wars were unpopular, or certain policies were causing unrest. Sometimes, this feedback could influence Senate decisions. Inscriptions have been found voicing public frustration, such as, "Senator Cicero can't even clean up his own mess." These writings reveal not only the humor of the Roman people, but their boldness, because if discovered, such remarks could lead to punishment. But still, people wrote. The latrina was their anonymous newspaper. Over time, these inscriptions multiplied so much that some walls became completely covered. Some people praised their lovers, others insulted their neighbors, while some openly criticized politicians. Many of these writings have been uncovered in archaeological excavations and help us understand the social psychology of that era. In this way, latrinas were places where Rome's public conscience spoke. Perhaps that's why some emperors issued decrees banning graffiti in latrinas. But did it work? No, because the latrina was never meant to be silent. Some philosophers even described latrina walls as the voice within the people. The real thoughts emerged here. Things one wouldn't say to someone's face could be carved into stone, and that stone would bear witness for centuries to come. The language of these writings varied, sometimes poetic, sometimes vulgar, sometimes furious, but almost always honest. Lines like, "I sat here and thought, where is this city headed?" expressed both personal and collective concerns. The toilet became a kind of public subconscious. This freedom of expression wasn't limited to walls. People debated in latrinas, exchanged ideas, and sometimes held serious political discussions. And often, what was said in the latrina would echo in the forum. Some senators would even go incognito, dressed in ordinary clothes, to eavesdrop on conversations and take the pulse of the people. The answer to, "What are the people saying?" wasn't found in the palaces. It was found on the stone seats. What's fascinating is that no one officially acknowledged the political influence of these spaces, but everyone knew. Because what was said here was more real than anywhere else. There was no reason to lie here. The body's release unlocked the mind. That's why many people made decisions here, or voiced their true feelings. Who knows? Maybe some of Rome's most important decisions were born not in the palace, but in the latrina. Some sources even claim that Caesar sent informants to these spaces to learn what was being said among the people, because both fear and hope were first voiced here. If the public was truly angry about something, it was in the latrina that you'd hear it first. The smell of waste was strong, but so was the scent of thought. Today, we see anonymous comments, criticisms, and complaints on social media. In ancient Rome, the equivalent was the latrina wall. Those stone walls were perhaps the ancestors of today's internet forums. People wrote without usernames, but everyone knew the words were real. That's why a single sentence written on a stone bench in Rome could mark the beginning of a decision, a revolt, or a joke. The latrina wasn't just for bodies, it was a place for thoughts to be released, too. And maybe that's why the greatest freedom in Rome was not the right to speak while standing, but the freedom to speak while sitting. Because people only truly spoke once they had relaxed. Some academic studies have analyzed in detail how these toilet inscriptions influence the political atmosphere, especially in certain periods. A rise in wall graffiti was seen as a sign of social unrest. In other words, the fuller the wall, the more tension there was in the system. That's why some emperors even appointed special workers to erase latrina writings. These individuals had to roam the city every morning, cleaning all the latrinas and scraping the stones. But people were undeterred. The next day, they would write again. Because as in Rome, ideas, like water, were always inclined to flow. In some cities, these writings even prompted humorous responses. For instance, when someone carved the senator as a pig, someone else added below, "No offense to pigs." These back and forth exchanges turned into something very much like today's comment threads. This form of communication became so widespread that some wealthy homeowners decorated their private toilets with humorous versions of such inscriptions. A wall that read, "My wife spends too much time here," served as both a complaint and a joke. All of this shows that in Rome, the latrina was the simplest and perhaps most touching scene of free expression. In ancient Rome, the latrina was not just found in city centers. It was a natural part of life in rural areas, villages, and military outposts. Interestingly, while Rome's toilet systems were seen as symbols of civilization, they were also extensions of its colonization policies. Whenever Rome settled a new area, it first built roads, then brought water, and shortly thereafter constructed a latrina. Because for Rome, order began at the toilet. That's why modern archaeologists, when examining an ancient site, first look for aqueducts and latrina remains. If there's a well-constructed latrina, chances are the place was once a Roman center. To build a latrina was to declare the area part of Rome. In some regions, especially Roman cities in North Africa and Anatolia, latrinas featured incredibly elaborate decorations, marble-carved seats, frescoes depicting mythological scenes, even courtyards adorned with fountains. These embellishments weren't just aesthetic. They showed that latrinas were also living spaces. Women's latrinas were often located in more secluded areas and frequently decorated with mosaics. Some inscriptions suggest that women socialized there, shared hair oil recipes, and confided in one another. These writings are especially important for tracking female life in ancient Rome, as direct records about women's daily routines are rare. There are also amusing anecdotes about how long people stayed in the latrina. Some were criticized for overstaying their welcome. "Marcus sat here in the morning and didn't get up till noon," reads one mocking line, showing that the latrina sometimes became a refuge or a place to hide. In some latrinas, there were designated waiting areas for when no seats were available. People would line up there, and of course, conversations often took place in line. Even the wait became a social moment. At times, street vendors could be seen in these areas. They sold snacks, perfumes, cleaning supplies, sometimes even books of poetry. Imagine reading a new poem while waiting your turn. In Rome, the toilet was no different from a bookshop. Some writings mention small wooden boxes left in latrina corners containing surprise gifts. Someone might hide a bottle of wine. Another might leave a love letter. These secret sharing gestures made the latrina not just public, but deeply personal. For children, these spaces were part of their education. Under adult supervision, they learned toilet etiquette, how to use the sponge, how to clean it, what not to do. Today, toilet training happens in the home, but in Rome, it was almost a public rite of passage. Another curious detail, the choice of materials in latrina architecture. While local stones were used in some places, luxurious cities preferred the imported marble and granite. This wasn't just about beauty, it was a political statement. It was a way of saying, "We are Rome," in stone. And let's not forget, some inscriptions included reminders like, "Keep quiet." People wanted to be left alone, to think. Sometimes a thinker or poet would treat the latrina like their personal meditation zone. So in some latrinas, silence was actually a rule. So when we think of a Roman toilet, we shouldn't just think of smells, stones, and water, but of life itself. There was love there, knowledge, commerce, and art. And maybe that's why a simple sentence, carved into a Roman stone, still gives us pause today. The toilet was not just a place of necessity. It was a mirror of one's relationship with oneself and with society. Some Roman philosophers believed the latrina experience was part of a return to nature. We came from nature. We return to it. Everything in between is smell and thought, reads one inscription that captures this philosophy perfectly. Lines like this prove that the latrina wasn't merely a place for the body, it was also a space for philosophical inquiry. In some military garrisons, latrina usage was even regulated by specific schedules. Scheduled toilet times were implemented because hygiene was ensured not only through cleanliness, but through order. Sources even suggest that this system reduced disease among Roman legions and positively affected morale. We also shouldn't forget that the Roman latrina culture inspired art. In some comedic plays, latrina scenes played a major role. While the audience laughed at the humorous situations characters faced in the toilet, they also recognized reflections of their own lives and experienced a form of catharsis, just as backstage dressing rooms are today's idea generators in theaters. The latrina served that purpose in Rome. Sometimes, the final rehearsal before a performance happened there, because everyone was there. Everyone was human there, unmasked. In short, the Roman latrina was not just a place for excretion, it was where a civilization most resembled itself. Perhaps that's why every line carved into a Roman toilet stone has now become a clue in the hands of historians or philosophers. These stones weren't just seats, they were starting points for stories that were written, drawn, felt, and passed down. Who knows? Maybe thousands of years from now, our current social media comments will be studied by archaeologists in the same way. They sat, thought, and wrote here, they might say. And it all began with a small piece of stone, a round hole, and a big story about being human. The latrina culture of ancient Rome was not just about meeting physical needs. It was closely tied to aesthetic and artistic expression. These toilets, surprisingly, became public stages for art, humor, and creativity. Wall writings were sometimes accompanied by caricatures or small frescoes. Among the inscriptions unearthed during excavations, there are puns, short poems, and even mini stories. One reads, "I sat, thought, and finally decided she doesn't love me." Beneath it, a small drawing, a broken heart, and a bird flying away. The Roman latrina was even a place where love spoke its mind. Some inscriptions reflected public opinion perfectly. The wine served on Sunday was watered down. Livia's cakes are like mud. These are essentially the ancestors of modern restaurant reviews. People didn't just leave waste. They left complaints too. Humorous writings were very common. "I became a philosopher while sitting here," or "This hole is deeper than I thought," show how time spent in the toilet could turn into a comic reflection. Another striking aspect was the presence of caricatures, tiny figures carved into stone, often depicted personal disputes, romantic dramas, or satire targeting public officials. On one stone, for example, a huge nose is drawn with the caption, "Senator Publius's nose is deeper than this hole." Humor in ancient Rome wasn't limited to the theater. It found its way into toilets too. Some inscriptions even mentioned stray animals. "Maximus the dog was here again," reads one note, almost like a record of a dog's daily toilet routine. Next to it, a small dog sketch. The Roman latrina wasn't just about humans. It reflected their relationship with their surroundings too. Among students, the writing tradition was especially common. Some youths would mock their teachers with jokes or carve humorous Latin grammar rules onto the walls. This shows how even in the toilet, education and humor were intertwined. These humorous writings are also believed to have helped relieve social stress. After wars, taxes, or famines, sitting in the latrina offered a moment of release and recentering. To write, to speak, to laugh. The psychological health of Roman society may have been hidden in these wall scribbles. In some toilets, social messages were even more explicit. "Slaves have something to say too," reveals how the lower classes also claimed this anonymous space. Because here, class distinctions melted away. Everyone was equal, both when sitting and when writing. Interestingly, some inscriptions became so popular that they were copied and passed to other latrinas. When a joke or satire resonated, it spread across the city like an early form of viral content. No one knew who wrote it, but everyone was talking about it. Anonymity made humor freer. Some writings became so popular that other latrinas had notes like "rewritten here" added to them. This practice shows how Roman toilets became networks of cultural communication. Eventually, toilet writings became so widespread that in some areas, city officials began framing them instead of erasing them, placing glass over them like little exhibitions. These turned latrina walls into open-air galleries. And they weren't just aesthetic choices. They were ways of preserving collective memory. In Rome, what mattered wasn't always written in official documents. It could be found in a single line carved into stone. A simple sentence on a toilet seat could reflect the entire spirit of an era. Through humor, complaint, love, and anger, the Roman latrina was an archive of humanity. Today, these preserved inscriptions in museums prove that ancient Rome wasn't sustained only through war, law, or architecture, but through the honest, simple language of daily life. And perhaps that's why the most genuine voice of that era echoes in just 3 words carved into stone. I was here too. Some of these writings were so impactful that poets or playwrights of the time took inspiration from latrina wall notes and used them in their works. There are even footnotes in certain literary texts stating, "This joke was taken from the latrina at the Forum." Thus, the latrina became a source of inspiration not just for ordinary citizens, but for the intellectual class as well. Imagine one small sentence etched into a stone wall, turning into a full theater play, performed before thousands. This was where real art met real life, and perhaps Roman humor drew its strength from being carved into stone. Because every joke carries emotion, every scribble reflects a thought. Latrina inscriptions are, in this sense, invaluable sources for understanding what a society laughed at, what made them angry, and what they found meaningful. And of course, behind all these inscriptions were anonymous heroes. Some were students, others workers, some perhaps soldiers or philosophers. They didn't pose for statues. Their names didn't enter history books, but their words, emotions, and courage still speak to us today. When we look at those stones now, we might see only a few words, but in truth, there lies a fingertip's trace, a seed of thought, a breath of an era, and that shows us the Roman latrina was not only a space for the body, but also a conduit for emotion, thought, and history. In ancient Rome, toilets weren't only found in city centers, elite homes, or public squares. They were also present in rural areas, farms, inns, and along roadsides. This widespread presence reveals how systematic and intentional Rome's approach to hygiene was. Roman roads didn't just carry military troops or merchant caravans. They also brought with them the hygiene system. Small latrinas, placed by roadsides, served travelers. These were usually positioned near fountains or rest areas. For Rome, a comfortable journey didn't just mean a paved road. It meant being able to sit and relieve oneself along the way. These rural latrinas were generally simpler. Instead of marble, stone, or terracotta was used. Instead of wall art, plain structures were favored. But their function remained the same. They were connected to the same sewage systems and integrated into the same water cycle. The system was identical, only the visuals were scaled down. It is even known that on some farms, latrinas worked in conjunction with animal manure. Human waste was transferred to fields as fertilizer, creating a closed-loop system. This shows that what we now call sustainable agriculture was practiced by Rome thousands of years ago. Latrinas at inns were often busy. These establishments hosted overnight travelers, and mornings were especially crowded. Some innkeepers even implemented early toilet access rules. Whoever arrived first went first. Inns' latrina walls contained writings in multiple languages. These toilets were also places of cultural exchange. A sentence from a Gallic merchant might appear next to a poem by a Greek bard. This multilingualism shows how vast and diverse the Roman world was, and how that diversity found its way even onto latrina walls. Travel-related messages were common. Notes like, I arrived here on the 5th day of March. I was tired. Sitting here brought me relief. Reveal that Romans saw the toilet as both a physical and emotional rest stop. Some inscriptions were even love letters. If you've sat in this inn's latrina too, know that I was thinking of you. This line transforms the privacy of the toilet into a kind of emotional intimacy. And this sincerity proves that the Roman latrina opened not just the body, but the heart. Sometimes small religious symbols could be found in rural latrinas as well. Figures used to pray for safe travels were hung by the door. This is proof that Rome didn't just see toilets as biological spaces, but symbolic ones too. The rural spread of the latrina system enhanced its universality. No matter where a Roman citizen was, they could find a latrina and experience the same comfort they were used to. This made Rome a civilization that conquered not only with war, but with toilets. Some travelers' journals even state, "Any place without a toilet isn't Rome." That sentence shows how deeply embedded and widespread the latrina system was. A toilet was like a boundary marker. If Rome hadn't laid stone there, it wasn't Rome. And of course, those stones were never without writing. A sentence scribbled by a weary traveler might make someone else smile. A shared language, a shared smell, a shared sense of humanity. Above all, the Roman toilet was a place of shared experience. In the countryside and the city, for the rich and the poor, everyone sat on the same hole, looked at the same walls, and read the same words. And maybe that's why Rome was less an empire and more a habit. It didn't endure by stacking stone upon stone, but by carving words into stone. Some archaeologists describe these roadside latrinas as points of imperial belonging for Roman citizens, especially in border towns. The presence of such toilets gave people a sense of safety. The common belief was, if there's a Roman-style latrina here, this place is secure. In some rural areas, these latrinas even served as venues for public gatherings. Particularly in farming villages, people would meet there to make decisions and discuss issues. The toilet, in a sense, functioned as the village square. Elsewhere, these latrinas were also used as educational spaces, especially when teaching children about nature, cyclical life, and the value of water and soil. The latrina was a perfect teaching tool. Both biological processes and social order could be observed there. And perhaps most strikingly, some ancient inscriptions include lines like, "I learned how to think here." Even for rural Romans, sitting on a stone wasn't just a physical act. It was a mental one too. Rome's inclusive approach to toilets continues to inspire modern urban planners. The idea of accessible hygiene points in rural areas is still something today's world hasn't fully achieved. Rome managed it thousands of years ago. Some of these rural latrinas still stand today, some between stones, others buried underground. But they all whisper the same thing. Someone lived here, thought here, sat here, and left a human trace. Ancient Rome is remembered not through grand victories, but through these small, profound imprints. Another surprising function of latrinas in ancient Rome was education. Yes, you heard that right. The toilet was also a place of learning. This was especially clear during the transitional periods when young men were preparing for public life. As elders sat in the latrina, young people would listen to their conversations absorbing social rules, humor, and even techniques of political debate. It's known that some philosophers held private discussions with their students in these spaces. The saying, "true knowledge emerges from a relaxed body," is believed to have originated from one of the era's famous thinkers. Because the latrina, where the body was in its most natural state and free from pride, was a place where every word spoken felt more honest. For Romans, learning didn't just happen in schools. The latrina was one of the most striking examples of Rome's street learning tradition, especially the jokes, idioms, and wordplay exchanged in public developed young people's social intelligence. Many latrina inscriptions carry traces of this entertaining learning process. Some latrinas even had grammar rules carved into the walls, Latin verb conjugations, short idioms, and even basic philosophical sentences. People didn't just go there to relieve themselves. They went to learn something too. For members of the enslaved class, these places were incredibly valuable. Forbidden from formal education, some slaves would improve their vocabulary and stay informed about current affairs by reading these wall texts. In some cases, slave names were carved beneath inscriptions, an attempt to leave their mark on history. Similarly, women benefited from these writings. Although women couldn't receive formal public education, they could nourish their minds through poems, proverbs, and sayings found on latrina walls. That's why some historians describe the Roman latrina as a hidden people's library. This educational side of the latrina eventually caught the attention of the state. In some cities, special inscriptions were carved into walls to provide young people with more knowledge. Notices about health, nutrition, and civic rules became a method of educating the public. Another function of these wall writings was to preserve memory. People carved significant dates, events, or personal experiences into the stones. Lines like, "First time I came here after my mother's death," or "I sat at this hole and found forgiveness," were fragments of personal history. In this way, the latrina became a kind of memory journal. Some people even used it as a space for therapy, a break from daily stress. Sit, think, write. No one judged you. No one contradicted you, because everyone was in the same position, trying to relax, lighten up, and reflect. This is why Roman latrina culture had not only a physical dimension, but a psychological one as well. People weren't just leaving behind waste. They were releasing burdens. Emotionally, mentally, and socially, they were lightening the load. Some historians argue that these spaces helped regulate people's emotions. In densely populated cities, one reason people may have been more patient and understanding with one another was the shared experience of latrina culture, because, at least for a moment each day, everyone sat in the same shared space, breathed the same air, and sat on the same stone. Interestingly, some inscriptions even mention meditation-like techniques. Phrases like, "take 3 breaths, sit and think," show that Romans viewed the latrina as a tool for introspection. This reveals just how multi-layered latrina culture truly was. And perhaps the best part was that all this learning happened completely naturally. There were no teachers, no curriculum, just writings, words, and a sincere atmosphere. In Rome, knowledge might come from a verse scribbled on a toilet wall, or from a story told by the old man sitting beside you. This is why the Roman latrina was the most unconventional classroom of the ancient world, a space where everyone was equal, where no judgment existed, and only truths and needs were expressed. This practice was so widespread that in some cities, wise individuals would routinely inspect the wall writings. What ideas were recurring? What words were being repeated? These clues were valuable in gauging the public's emotional state. Latrina walls were believed to serve as a kind of social mind map because although the writings were anonymous, they were deeply personal. No one stole another's opinion. Everyone shared their own emotions and thoughts, and that brought diversity and authenticity. In Rome, knowledge wasn't confined to libraries. It could emerge from a stone, a scent, or a laugh. The latrina was both the source and carrier of this knowledge, like a quiet classroom full of meaning. And today, many of these writings have been unearthed in archaeological digs and are now exhibited in museums. In a way, they can be seen as the ancestors of modern graffiti. Some are political, some romantic, others absurd but humorous, each one reflecting a facet of Roman life. Some texts read, "I wrote this here because no one was listening." That's not just a wall carving, it's a symbol of helplessness and at the same time, of creative expression. This is why the Roman latrina was a place not only for physical relief, but also emotional and mental release, and every word continues to echo thousands of years later. Another striking feature of ancient Rome's latrina culture was its contribution to social solidarity. These spaces weren't only for conversation or idea exchange, they also functioned as places where those in need were helped and supported in difficult moments. The elderly, the sick, or the lonely were often known to struggle in these facilities. In such cases, other members of the community would step in to assist. Inscriptions like, "I handed the sponge to old Amulius," reflect not just physical help, but a culture of communal support. Some people would share their troubles while waiting their turn, receive advice, or be offered small acts of kindness. This made the latrina a space where empathy blossomed and social bonds were reinforced in Roman society. Just like today's neighborhood cafes or park benches, the stone-seated latrinas of Rome served that function. For those in need, they were a kind of safe space. No one looked down on anyone there. Everyone was in the same condition, and this equality fostered greater understanding between people. This understanding extended beyond individuals and gradually took root institutionally. Some city councils even enacted special decrees for the maintenance of latrinas and for ensuring easier access for the disadvantaged. In some regions, help attendants were assigned, people who would clean the toilets and assist the elderly or ill. Some charitable Romans would leave water bowls, cleaning cloths, or aromatic herbs at the entrances. These small gestures were deeply respected, and in some cases, the names of those who offered them were etched into stone. Lucius's lavender water was here. Women's solidarity also stood out, especially in female-only sections of the latrina. Emotional connections would form, even briefly, among women who didn't know one another. Notes have been found where they gave advice, shared tea recipes, or confided about their children. For women, the latrina was a sort of sanctuary. This form of social communication helped ease societal burdens and gradually transformed latrinas into quasi psychological counseling centers. A grieving person might tell their story to a stranger and find a shoulder to lean on without expecting anything in return. The latrina was a place for both tears and laughter. Some inscriptions even read, "We met here and then became friends." People left not only waste, but also traces of humanity. And this was one of the foundational elements of Rome's social fabric. The Roman latrina was also a space of protection, especially in cold weather. Enclosed latrinas served as small shelters. Poor people would come to warm up, clean themselves, drink a cup of water, and chat. Charitable citizens would leave dry food. One inscription still visible today reads, "I found it here and fed myself." Even in Roman law, harming someone in or around a latrina was considered a serious offense that disrupted public peace. These spaces were sacred, places where the body was vulnerable and the spirit delicate. Fights didn't break out there. Everyone was equal in the act of relieving. Some archaeological findings include small inscriptions at the entrances. Keep it clean, not just for yourself, but for everyone. This shows that these spaces weren't just used, they were collectively preserved. The modern concept of public health may have taken root in the Roman latrina, because there, physical health, emotional balance, and social harmony coexisted. Everyone respected those who came before and made things easier for those who came after. And perhaps that's why, in Rome, humanity wasn't just found in temples, but sometimes lived right on a stone seat. There, people would extend a hand to the elderly, support the fallen. The latrina was a test of hygiene and of human decency. Today, we might not know how much of this culture lives on in our modern restrooms, but ancient Rome whispers this truth. A toilet is not just a necessity, it is an invisible thread that holds society together. And sometimes, that thread is hidden in a sponge on a stick, or a phrase carved into stone. Another example of latrina solidarity was the sharing rituals held on special days. During certain holidays, people would leave small notes, food, or decorations in the latrina, offering blessings for whoever would come next. This custom was especially common during winter. In some cities, leaving votive offerings in latrinas became a tradition. To ensure success in a job, the recovery of a sick relative, or the safe return of a loved one from war, people would place small stones, flowers, or amulets in latrina corners. These weren't publicly displayed, but everyone knew that stone carried the trace of a prayer. And maybe that's why the Roman latrina was considered sacred, almost like a ritual space, because a person at their most vulnerable is also their most honest self. And every word spoken, every kind gesture, every line inscribed there was a powerful, simple declaration of what it means to be human. In ancient Rome, the latrina was not only a social, aesthetic, or hygienic space, it was also a political one. Toilets revealed the true relationship between everyday people and the state. It was where the public voice, raw and unfiltered, could be seen and heard. Some archaeological findings are filled with political messages carved into latrina walls. Phrases like, "Senators talk too much, we're silent here," or "The new tax burden strained even this hole," show how the public perceived the political climate. For the Roman people, the toilet was not just a place for physical relief. It was a space to complain about the system. Most of these inscriptions were anonymous, but bold and witty. Satire was one of the Roman public's sharpest tools. Jokes about corrupt officials often resonated more than formal speeches. In fact, periods of increased satirical graffiti often coincided with major political unrest. The more biting the messages on the walls, the greater the unease in the streets. These walls became a kind of barometer, reflecting the people's frustration, fear, or even hope. Some emperors took these messages seriously enough to order officials to collect and analyze them, to answer the question, what does the public feel? They looked not to crowds in the forum, but to the words on latrina walls, because in the toilet, a person was alone, unmasked, and brutally honest. Some walls even bore the words, "We're tired of writing." That was the cry of a weary people. The emotional weight carried in these spaces could sometimes spark broader movements. In Rome, information traveled slowly, but with weight, and the first place it spread was through toilet walls. Another example, conversations that began in the latrina and spread into the city square, especially near forums. Latrina discussions often became the starting point of larger debates. Ideas first shared here would evolve into public consensus. In Rome, idea generation didn't just happen in academies. It happened on cold stone seats, and those ideas could be powerful enough to influence policy. In fact, some city reforms were enacted following complaints, first carved into latrina walls. This shows that Roman society wasn't just top-down. It also flowed bottom-up. The people created their own language, their own platform, their own media, and that media wasn't where waste flowed, but where thought was born. Some scholars argue that these writings were the daily face of Roman democracy. Even if people couldn't vote, they voiced their views, and those views sometimes reached the palace. That's why the latrina was not just a biological structure, it was a political one. Silence didn't exist there. Everyone spoke, and no one remained silent. It was a system remarkably similar to modern social media. Anonymous, uncensored, straight from the people. And that's what made it powerful. To historians, Roman toilets are not merely architectural relics. They are one of the most accurate keys to decoding the spirit of an ancient society. A sentence carved into a latrina wall can sometimes say more than 1,000 pages of legislation because it comes from genuine feeling. And maybe that's why Rome's most honest history isn't written on scrolls or in decrees. It's written above a stone hole, in just a few words. There, humanity can be seen in its rawest, purest form. Some of these inscriptions later became slogans, passed down by word of mouth. A joke that started on a toilet wall would reach a market vendor the next day and later find its way into a senator's speech in the forum. That's the power of a people who know how to amplify their voice. Some lines etched into stone are so powerful, they still provoke thought even today. They make the decisions. We just sit. Statements like this carry both humor and a sharp sense of complaint. They make you laugh and think. That alone explains why the Roman latrina remains so compelling. In some places, inscriptions at the toilet entrance read, "Speak, but think first." This shows that even in the most mundane of places, there existed an ethical code. Everyone could speak, but respect was essential. In Roman toilets, justice, thought, and freedom of expression met in stone, in words, and yes, even in smell. What resulted was nothing short of a mirror for society. In some cities, following major events, an explosion of graffiti would appear in public latrinas. A new tax decree, the toilet walls would fill. A general suffered defeat, stones would quickly bear inscriptions. Over time, these writings became a channel carefully monitored by Roman leadership. The latrina wasn't just the voice of the past, but the echo of the future. Each line carved into its walls captured the pulse of an entire age. Some emperors likely read their most honest criticisms on those walls, because what someone writes when they are alone and at ease is almost always the truth. Now that we've explored the culture of the Roman latrina from beginning to end, there's something deeper that stands out among all the stone seats, sponge sticks, and wall scribbles. The Roman latrina was not just a place for waste, it was a place where the human spirit, social awareness, and collective memory truly lived. Some of these ancient toilet structures still stand today, and thousands of years later, they still speak to us. On the cold face of a stone, in the shaky letters carved into the wall, lies the voice of a person. Perhaps someone afraid, someone amused, someone loved, someone left alone. And those voices still speak to us. Above all, the latrina was a place of sincerity. There was no show, no masks, no tricks. There, the body's most honest form met the mind's most unfiltered thoughts. Despite the smell, it reeked of truth. When we look around modern cities, lost among digital screens, maybe we envy that Roman man who once sat on a stone seat and turned to his neighbor to ask, "What do you think?" Because he was truly speaking, and he was truly heard. The Roman latrina doesn't just tell us about the past, it shows us ourselves. It reminds us how much we've grown apart, how lonely we've become, how artificial we sometimes feel. Those stones are still there. The words carved on them are still readable. I thought here. I cried here. I laughed here. And those words still strike a nerve after the thousands of years. Because this wasn't just a place for excrement to flow. It was a space where a society thought, felt, and expressed itself. And maybe the truest history was written right there. Today, we write to screens. In Rome, they wrote to stone. Sometimes we hit a key without even feeling it. They carved into stone with their whole body. So what they engraved was not just a word, it was a feeling. The Roman latrina teaches us that even in our most basic state, humans search for meaning. The need for expression never fades. And so, this story doesn't really end. This story is us. We're still people searching for a stone, still writing, still wanting to share. And maybe, someday, on a concrete wall in a modern city, someone will carve something again. I was here, because we're always the same, always alone, always longing to speak, always yearning to be heard. The Roman latrina never lets us forget that. Today, we no longer write on walls. We tweet, we comment, we post emojis. But it's the same at the core. To express, to share, to be heard. In Rome, there was a stone wall. Today, there's a screen. The surface has changed, but the human behind it hasn't. They still love, fear, hope, complain. The one who carved taxes are too high in Rome is the same as the one tweeting rent is insane today. That's why the Roman latrina is like a time machine. It shows us not only the past, but the present. Every message there is an ancestor of the ones we leave today. When we look at ancient latrina remains in museums, we're not just seeing old stones. We're witnessing the soul of an era, the voice of a people, the raw form of humanity. So if you smile or feel a pang in your heart while hearing this story, know that you are not alone. Thousands of years ago, someone else sat on a stone bench, set down their sponge, and felt the very same things. That's history. That's humanity. Let's end with one final thought. The latrina wasn't an end. It was a beginning. Every time someone sat, with every release came a rebirth. They let go of their burdens and walked back into life. And maybe that's why Roman toilets are not just the foundations of a civilization, but of the very experience of being human. Because everything that happened there, real, raw, unforgettable, still lives with us. Now, close your eyes. Picture a stone wall. Carved into it are small words. I was here, and so are you. Why did Viking warriors carry ravens under the cold gray skies of the North Atlantic, long before compasses, GPS, or even reliable maps? A fleet of slender, dragon-headed longships cut through icy waves. At their helms stood men of iron resolve, Vikings, armed not only with axes and swords, but with something stranger, ravens. Yes, actual ravens, kept in small cages aboard their ships like feathered oracles. Why? Because in a world where fog could swallow the sun and currents could trick even the most seasoned sailor, these blackbirds were the Vikings' secret weapon in navigation. Let's pause here. You might be thinking, they carried birds for navigation? Absolutely. The Norse weren't just savage raiders. They were master seafarers. And before the magnetic compass made its way to Europe, these cunning navigators looked to nature. Their gods were in the sky, their runes carved into stones, and their answers often flew on wings. The raven, in particular, held a special place in Norse mythology. Odin, the Allfather, was said to have two ravens, Hugin, thought, and Munin, memory, that flew around the world and brought him knowledge. These birds weren't just sacred. They were smart, observant, and symbolic of divine guidance. So naturally, when a Viking set sail for unknown lands, bringing a raven was like bringing a piece of the gods with him. But beyond myth, there was genius in the method. Picture a crew lost in open sea, no land in sight. The water stretches to the horizon like an endless mirror of doom. That's when the cage is opened, and a raven is released. If it circled and returned to the ship, the message was clear. Land was nowhere nearby. But if the raven flew straight and didn't look back, then it had spotted something. Land. This wasn't just folklore. It was a practical system. Some sources suggest Vikings even carried 3 birds per journey, releasing them in intervals to confirm direction. Icelandic sagas make reference to Floki Vilgerdarson, an explorer said to have discovered Iceland this way in the 9th century. According to legend, he released a raven that flew northwest and never returned. He followed its path and landed on a new, unknown shore, Iceland. Now, let's address the logistics. Were the birds trained? No, they didn't need to be. Ravens have exceptional homing instincts, but more importantly, they instinctively fly toward land if released at sea, an evolutionary trait rooted in survival. In other words, the Viking didn't need to teach the bird anything. It simply needed to open the cage and watch. Still, these voyages weren't exactly serene cruises, with birds fluttering joyfully around. The sea was brutal. Storms hit with no warning. Food spoiled. Men froze to death. Sometimes the birds never returned, not because there was no land, but because they too were swallowed by the merciless skies. But in an age of daring, where death was expected and fate was whispered in mead halls, this method was as reliable as anything else they had. Interestingly, not all ships carried ravens. The practice seemed more common during exploratory voyages than routine raids. Once they knew a route, say, to the coast of England or the monasteries of Ireland, they didn't need bird-guided direction. But when they ventured westward into the unknown, when they dared reach what they called the edge of the world, the ravens came along. So the next time someone calls Vikings primitive or just brutal bearded invaders, remember this. They tamed the sea with no compass, no sextant, no GPS voice saying, recalculating. Instead, they looked at the stars, listened to the waves, and when desperate, trusted the silent flight of a blackbird to show them the way. This isn't just a tale of clever navigation. It's a story about trust. Trust in nature, in myth, and messin in one another. The raven wasn't just a tool. It was a symbol, a reminder that even in the harshest journey, guidance could come in the most unexpected form. By now, you know that ravens were more than just navigational aids for the Vikings. But to truly grasp why these birds were so deeply revered and feared, we need to look at their other role as harbingers of war and omens of fate. In the blood-soaked theater of Viking warfare, the battlefield was more than a place of combat. It was a spiritual space. And where there was blood, there were ravens. These black-winged creatures were often the first to appear after a skirmish, feasting on the remains of the fallen. To outsiders, they were simply scavengers. But to the Norse, they were sacred messengers, feasting not just on flesh, but on destiny itself. Let's go back to Odin, the All-Father. As god of war, wisdom, and the dead, he didn't just have two ravens as companions. He was often depicted in full armor with them perched on his shoulders, whispering secrets. These weren't decorative birds in the myths. Hugin and Munin were thought to inform Odin of everything happening across the realms, including the fate of warriors. So when Vikings saw ravens circling above, before, or after battle, it wasn't random. It was a sign, a communication from the divine, a seal of approval, or perhaps a warning. That's why many Viking war banners featured ravens, sometimes mid-flight, sometimes perched with beaks open, calling out. The most famous of these was the legendary raven banner, carried into battle by Norse chieftains and kings. Now, here's the eerie part. The raven banner wasn't just a cool flag. According to sagas and oral histories, it was believed to hold real power. When the banner fluttered in the wind, it meant Odin favored the army. Victory was likely. But, and this is the catch, victory came at a price. The banner bearer was often doomed to die. The idea was that the banner drew the favor of the gods and the envy of fate. Carrying it was both an honor and a death sentence. These weren't just poetic metaphors. Several Viking leaders were said to have carried raven banners into famous battles, including the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok during their campaigns in England. English sources described how the banner moved as if alive when carried into combat. Whether that's superstition or just good storytelling, we'll never know. But what's certain is that the symbol of the raven inspired terror in Viking enemies and awe among their allies. The association between ravens and death wasn't just Norse either. Other European cultures, from the Celts to the Anglo-Saxons, also feared the raven's cry. It was seen as an omen of doom, a signal that war or misfortune was near. But where others saw terror, the Vikings saw destiny. Death wasn't to be avoided. It was to be met with honor, especially if one hoped to enter Valhalla, Odin's great hall of the slain. There's also something poetic about the raven's role. It feeds on death but doesn't kill. It observes from above, detached yet ever present, much like the Norse belief in fate or weird. The raven watches as events unfold, neither causing nor preventing them. It simply is, a black-winged constant in a chaotic world. That perspective made its way into Viking art and literature too. Carvings of ravens adorn rune stones across Scandinavia. Raven imagery appears on swords, jewelry, shields, and even burial goods. These weren't random decorations. They were part of an identity. To bear the raven was to embrace both war and wisdom, savagery and strategy. And perhaps that duality is why the raven became the perfect symbol for Viking culture. They were brutal, yes, but also philosophical. They believed in fate, but still fought to change it. They worshipped gods who gave them signs, but interpreted those signs through blood, steel, and bone. So when you imagine a Viking warrior staring into the stormy horizon with a raven perched on his arm, don't think of it as a cliché. Think of it as a cultural echo, a belief that the bird wasn't just a creature, it was a mirror, a reflection of everything the Vikings believed about life, death, and what lay beyond. If you were a Viking setting sail from Norway in the 9th century, you weren't just preparing for a trip, you were inviting fate aboard. The ocean was vast, unpredictable, and deadly. There were no maps that stretched beyond familiar coasts. Yet somehow, Viking longships made it to Iceland, Greenland, and even North America centuries before Columbus. We already know ravens played a part, but they were just one piece of a much larger puzzle. Let's fly a little higher and explore how the Vikings navigated the unknown. First, understand this. Viking navigation was not guesswork. It was a sophisticated blend of experience, intuition, and nature's clues. The sun, the stars, ocean swells, migrating birds, seaweed, watercolor, and cloud shapes, all were instruments in a Norse sailor's mental toolbox. But what happened when the skies turned gray and visibility dropped to zero? That's where the raven shined. Quite literally. Remember, the bird's value wasn't just its instincts, but its behavior. A raven released during a foggy voyage might not see land directly, but its choice to return or fly forward gave immediate feedback. It was, in essence, a biological compass. Interestingly, Scholars also suspect the Vikings used another tool, the sunstone. This mysterious object, possibly Iceland spar, a transparent calcite crystal, could polarize light. Even on cloudy days or near sunset, sailors could hold the stone to the sky, rotated it, and determine the sun's location. This gave them a bearing, even when the sun itself was hidden. Combined with the raven, you now had a two-tiered system, a mystical stone to sense the sun, and a living creature to verify direction. Let's not forget the role of songs and oral memory. Navigation wasn't just spatial, it was cultural. Viking navigators memorized the feel of a route, how long it took, what kind of swells to expect, what birds to look for, and how the air smelled near land. These weren't written down. They were passed orally from one generation to the next. In this way, navigation was part art, part apprenticeship. Of course, ravens remained central, not just practically, but spiritually. In fact, some Viking captains are believed to have consulted rune stones and omens before even letting the bird fly. If the gods disapproved, the raven stayed in its cage. If the signs were favorable, the cage was opened with ceremony. In a world where the divine and the physical were constantly overlapping, even the simplest action, like setting a bird free, could have cosmic implications. But here's where it gets fascinating. Recent archaeological discoveries suggest that some Viking ships had small enclosures near the mast, just large enough for animal cages. While we can't be 100% sure, the theory is that these were built for birds, ravens, or possibly doves. If true, it proves how central this strategy was to Viking exploration. These weren't ad hoc bird boxes. They were integrated into the ship's design. This ritualistic use of birds also finds echoes in other ancient cultures. Phoenician traders, Polynesian sailors, and even early Chinese explorers used birds to find land, but the Norse made it their own. For them, the raven was more than a tool. It was part of a cosmic order. And speaking of the cosmos, let's talk about the Viking sky. The Norse believed the heavens were full of signs. The northern lights, aurora borealis, were sometimes seen as the glimmering spears of the Valkyries, female warriors who chose which soldiers would live or die in battle. Stars formed constellations. But unlike the Greek zodiac, Viking stargazing was deeply local and tied to navigation rather than fate. So imagine it. You're standing on the deck of a Viking ship. The wind is cold, the fog is thick, and every wave feels like it might capsize your vessel. Your crew is nervous. The raven flaps inside its cage, restless. You whisper a prayer to Odin, press the sunstone to the sky, and find your direction. Then, with a nod from your navigator, you unlatch the cage. The raven bursts into the mist, and every man on board watches. If it fleets forward and disappears, your hearts lift. Land is ahead. If it circles and returns, you wait. And if it drops into the sea, the gods have made their decision. That blend of science, superstition, and survival, that was Viking navigation, and the raven was its beating, feathered heart. As Viking ships disappeared into legend, and their longhouses crumbled into moss-covered ruins, one thing remained etched into the memory of Europe: the raven. This bird, so central to Norse exploration, warfare, and spiritual belief, didn't vanish with the last Viking raid. Instead, it soared beyond time, into myth literature, archaeology, and even modern national symbols. Let's start with death, the Viking way. For a people obsessed with valor and the afterlife, burial customs were rich with symbolism. Warriors were often buried with their weapons, armor, and personal treasures. But in some high-status graves, archaeologists have uncovered something striking: bird bones, specifically raven bones. Take the Oseberg ship burial in Norway, one of the richest Viking-era finds. While it primarily held two noblewomen, it also contained a curious mix of animal remains, including the bones of birds, though not all could be definitively identified. Similar burials have yielded remains consistent with corvids, ravens, and crows. Were they pets? Sacrificial offerings? Spiritual companions? The answer is unclear, but the presence of these birds in funerary contexts suggests a belief that they accompanied the dead into the afterlife, or perhaps served as messengers between realms. That idea isn't far-fetched. In Norse cosmology, the boundaries between life and death were porous. Valhalla wasn't just a warrior's paradise. It was a continuation of the saga, a place where the raven might still circle above the hall, reminding warriors of their past glories and future battles. And this mythology didn't die with the conversion to Christianity. Instead, it transformed. In the centuries after the Viking Age, ravens became both feared and revered across Europe. Christian monks, who had once chronicled Viking attacks in terrified script, began to reinterpret the raven in new lights, sometimes as a symbol of Satan, sometimes as a prophetic bird akin to the dove of Noah. Old habits died hard, and in rural areas of Scandinavia and the British Isles, folklore kept the raven alive in eerie tales. Farmers swore ravens could speak. Sailors said they brought omens of storms. And in some Icelandic traditions, the raven remained a guide through magical rituals well into the Middle Ages. Literature, too, preserved the raven's mystique. Centuries after the last Viking had swung an axe in battle, poets and writers picked up the bird's story. Think Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, with its haunting refrain and embodiment of lost knowledge. While Poe wasn't writing about Vikings, his use of the raven as a symbol of memory and madness echoes the Norse pairing of hugin and munin, thought and memory. It's as if the old gods whispered through the pages. Even today, the raven flies proudly in national symbols. The Icelandic Coast Guard uses a raven as its insignia. The Royal Norwegian Air Force has incorporated raven motifs in certain patches. And in the UK, a small colony of ravens is kept at the Tower of London. Legend says if they ever leave, the kingdom will fall. A superstition with possible Viking roots, considering the Norse raided London multiple times and left their mark on its folklore. Beyond symbolism, the raven lives on in the field of science as well. Modern researchers study raven intelligence with awe. These birds demonstrate problem-solving skills, social structures, and even play. They mourn their dead. They hold grudges. They teach their young. In many ways, they are nature's historians, watching, remembering, adapting. It's no wonder the Vikings thought them sacred. Perhaps they were right. So what does all this tell us? That the Vikings weren't merely warriors. They were observers. They looked to the world around them and read its signs. Where others saw a scavenger, they saw a prophet. Where others feared the darkness, they embraced it. The raven, then, is more than a Viking relic. It's a bridge between past and present, between myth and fact, between the living and the dead. So the next time you see a raven perched silently on a fence or circling the sky in eerie stillness, remember, it's been watching humanity for a very long time. It watched as long ships vanished into mist. It saw the rise and fall of kings. It's seen cities burn and empires fade. And through it all, it remembers. Maybe that's why the Vikings brought them along. Not just to find land, but to find meaning in the swirling smoke of Viking fires, whether from celebratory feasts or solemn rites. The raven was often more than a silent observer. It was a participant, a witness, sometimes even the recipient of sacred offerings. To understand the full depth of the Norse connection with these dark-feathered birds, we must venture into the flickering world of Viking rituals, where fire, blood, and feathers blended in ceremonies that aimed to pierce the veil between men and gods. Let's begin with the idea of blot, a Norse sacrificial rite. Unlike modern perceptions of pagan bloodbaths, blot ceremonies were deeply structured events. They could involve animals, mead, sacred objects, and symbolic gestures, all carried out to gain favor from the gods, appease fate, or ensure success in travel or battle. Ravens, as symbols of Odin, were often central to these rites. While there is limited direct archaeological evidence of ravens being sacrificed, saga literature and poetic references suggest they were at least symbolically honored in rituals. Sometimes, offerings were made not of the raven, but to the raven. Before a journey, a warrior might throw a piece of meat into the sky to feed a raven as a way of invoking Odin's protection. After a successful raid or battle, blood was smeared onto standing stones, while ravens circled above, as if sealing a covenant between men and gods. In many ways, the raven became a celestial postman, delivering messages of loyalty, gratitude, or fear to the divine. The cider, a form of Norse magic practiced especially by women known as volur, also sometimes referenced birds. These priestesses, cloaked in symbols and trance-like states, were known to channel knowledge from the gods or the spirit world. Ravens, with their reputation for memory and their eerie calls, were believed to be omens or even familiars. Some volur wore cloaks of feathers, raven feathers in particular, as a mark of their connection to divine insight. This spiritual reverence extended even into burial rites. We've already touched on raven bones, found in high-status graves, but in some cases, feathers were buried with the dead, sewn into cloaks or placed in hands. The logic? The feathers were meant to aid the soul's journey to the afterlife, much like Egyptian funerary boats or Christian angels. The raven in this vision wasn't a scavenger. It was a guide, flapping silently between the world of men and the unknown shores beyond. In fact, one haunting poem from the poetic Edda, the Havamal, includes Odin himself speaking of hanging from the world tree, sacrificing himself to gain knowledge of the runes. Scholars have long debated whether the ravens were present during this ordeal, circling above their master, bearing witness as he hung between life and death. In this way, ravens were not just symbols, they were spiritual infrastructure, ever present in the construction of belief and myth. Even seasonal festivals honored ravens indirectly. During Yule, the midwinter celebration, great fires were lit, stories were told, and omens were read in the behavior of animals, including the flight patterns of birds. A raven seen flying against the wind, or one that cawed unusually close to the hearth, was considered a sign. Whether good or ill depended on the interpreter, but the message was clear. The gods were watching, and they had sent their messenger. What makes all of this remarkable is how it reveals the Viking worldview. To them, the raven wasn't just a thing in nature. It was part of a network, a link between realms, a feathered thread in the web of weird. And like all threads in that cosmic web, it could tangle, twist, or lead the way forward. So, when we imagine Viking rituals, let's look beyond the cliches of war cries and drinking horns. Picture instead a quiet glade at dusk. A warrior kneels beside a tree, whispering into the wind. In his hand, a black feather. In the branches above, a raven watches. No words are exchanged, but a message is sent. Something old, something sacred, something only the sky can carry. More than a millennium has passed since Viking ships last creaked across the North Sea, with caged ravens aboard. Yet, the image of the raven, sharp-eyed, dark-winged, steeped in shadow and story, still perches in our collective imagination. This final chapter isn't just about history, it's about legacy. How did this creature, once a literal tool of navigation and a harbinger of death, survive the fall of the Viking Age and rise into the fabric of modern culture, art, science, and symbolism? First, consider the sheer persistence of raven symbolism across centuries. Even after Christianity took firm hold in Scandinavia, the raven didn't vanish into superstition. Instead, it adapted. In folklore, it became a witch's companion, a graveyard sentinel, or the whispering spirit of the restless dead. Old Norse sagas, preserved in Iceland long after most Viking traditions faded, kept raven lore alive in ink and parchment. And as Romanticism swept through Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, artists and poets rediscovered the bird as a metaphor for mystery and the unknowable. Enter Edgar Allan Poe. In 1845, his iconic poem, The Raven, turned the bird into a symbol of grief, madness, and memory. The line, "Nevermore," echoed not just through the halls of Gothic literature, but through centuries of Viking belief. Though Poe likely wasn't directly inspired by Norse mythology, the resonance is undeniable. Hugin and Munin, thought and memory, were Odin's twin ravens. Poe's creation seemed to echo that deep ancestral rhythm. The idea that birds know what we forget and speak truths we can't. Ravens also found a home in national and institutional symbolism. Iceland, the spiritual heir to Norse tradition, still reveres the raven. Its Coast Guard emblem proudly displays the bird, echoing its ancient role as a guide over icy seas. In Britain, the Tower of London's ravens are both tourist attraction and prophetic legend. Supposedly, if they ever leave, the crown will fall. It's a story rooted more in modern myth than medieval fact. But the choice of bird is no accident. And then came the age of cinema, video games, and fantasy literature, where ravens soared yet again. In Tolkien's Middle-earth, ravens act as messengers and guardians, especially to the dwarves, likely influenced by Norse myth. In George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire series, and its TV adaptation Game of Thrones, ravens deliver messages across the continent, some even whispering like the birds of Odin. The three-eyed raven, who sees beyond time, is perhaps the most direct pop culture nod to Hugin and Munin in video games like Assassin's Creed. Valhalla, ravens serve as both spiritual familiars and literal drones, replacing the ancient Viking use of birds as scouts with modern gameplay mechanics. The past becomes play, and the raven bridges the gap. Even in science, ravens continue to astound. Studies have shown they can plan for the future, understand analogies, use tools, and even solve complex puzzles faster than some primates. Their intelligence is rivaled only by their eerie ability to mimic human speech and gestures. It's no wonder cultures across time have attributed supernatural insight to them. In many ways, modern science is confirming what Vikings believed instinctively, that ravens know more than they let on. In fashion, art, and tattoos, the raven remains a favorite. It adorns the arms of modern-day Norse enthusiasts, the backs of rock musicians, the pages of graphic novels, not as a grim warning, but as a celebration of resilience, intelligence, and identity. The bird that once flew across blood-stained fields now soars through gallery walls and screensavers, reborn in style and meaning. Why does the raven endure while so many other symbols fade? Because it represents contradiction. It is wise and wild, a predator and a prophet, a scavenger and a sacred messenger. It defies easy labels, just like the Vikings themselves. It reminds us that the world is not black and white, but feathered in shadow, wind, and whisper. So, if you've followed this journey from the decks of longships to the ink of modern novels, ask yourself, what have we really inherited from the Vikings? Is it their swords, their ships, their sagas, or is it their way of seeing the world through the eyes of a raven? The next time you see one perched above your window or hear its call in the early morning, remember, it may not be carrying messages from Odin anymore, but it's still watching, still remembering, and perhaps, just perhaps, it's waiting to guide someone lost, just as it did 1,000 years ago on a fog-covered sea.